Imagine the scene. An elderly couple, Abraham and Sarah, living in an unknown land, holding on to a promise that seemed impossible to fulfill. They had waited for decades, faced challenges, and at times doubted. Yet God had said, "I will make of you a great nation." But how could this be possible if they had no children and time seemed to be against them? Then, against all odds, something incredible happened. God fulfilled his word and gave them Isaac, the child of the promise, a miracle that changed the course of world history. But who really was Isaac? He is much more than the son of Abraham and Sarah. His life reflects God's faithfulness, a testimony that his promises are always fulfilled, even when everything seems contrary. In this video, you will uncover the highs and lows of Isaac's life, from his miraculous birth to the challenges he faced as the heir of a divine promise. Stay until the end of this video to understand the true story of Isaac, the child of the promise. Isaac is known as the child of the promise, a title that carries profound meaning within the biblical narrative. He was not merely the miraculous son of Abraham and Sarah, born when both were already advanced in age, but also the direct fulfillment of the divine promise made by God to Abraham. This promise guaranteed that through Abraham's descendants, God would raise a great nation, a chosen nation, to reveal his purpose and his glory to the world. Isaac represents God's faithfulness and power in fulfilling what he promises, even when human circumstances seem impossible. His birth was a supernatural act, showing that nothing is too difficult for the Lord. Through Isaac, God began to establish a sacred lineage that would culminate in the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, the greatest descendant of Abraham, and the one who would bring salvation not only to Israel, but to all the peoples of the earth. It is easier to understand why Isaac is called the child of the promise when we delve deeper into the story of Abraham, his father. Abraham lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, a land marked by idolatry and pagan customs. However, God, in his sovereignty, chose Abraham for a special purpose, calling him to leave his land, his relatives, and his father's house to go to a land that he would show him. This call, recorded in Genesis chapter 12, was not merely a geographical change, but also a spiritual and cultural one, a break from the past to fulfill God's divine plans. The promise that God made to Abraham was bold and seemingly impossible. He would make Abraham the father of a great nation, magnify his name, and through his descendants, all the families of the earth would be blessed. However, there was a crucial detail. Abraham and his wife, Sarah, had no children, and Sarah was barren. When Abraham left Haran in obedience to God's call, he was 75 years old, a time in life when the hopes of having children had practically vanished. Perhaps he thought that God's promises would be fulfilled quickly, but that is not how it happened. God has a sovereign agenda. He operates beyond human understanding, and his timing is perfect, even though it often seems slow to us. In his infinite wisdom, God establishes a purpose for every moment, guiding events and circumstances according to his eternal plans. The story of Abraham and the promise of Isaac is one of the clearest demonstrations of this truth. It was only when Abraham was 100 years old that God's promise was fulfilled. This means that from the time Abraham left Haran for Canaan, obeying the Lord's command, until the birth of Isaac, the child of the promise, 25 years passed. The name Isaac, which means laughter or he who laughs, carries a profound and symbolic meaning, reflecting both the initial disbelief and the joy that marked the fulfillment of God's promise. It was God himself who chose this name for the child of the promise, as we read in Genesis chapters 17 and 19, highlighting that every aspect of this story was under his sovereign control. The choice of the name Isaac is directly tied to human reactions to the divine promise. When God declared to Abraham that Sarah, his wife already advanced in age, would give birth to a son, Abraham laughed in his heart, as recorded in Genesis chapter 17, verse 17. This laughter was not just disbelief, but also a mix of surprise and wonder at what seemed humanly impossible. Later, in Genesis chapter 18, God renewed the promise, and this time it was Sarah's turn to laugh, this time with a touch of doubt. She was listening behind the tent when God reaffirmed that within 1 year she would give birth to a son. Her silent laughter reflected her struggle to believe in something so extraordinary. This laughter, which began with doubt and disbelief, was transformed into laughter of joy and gratitude when the promise was finally fulfilled. In Genesis chapter 21, verse 6, after Isaac's birth, Sarah declared, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." The name Isaac thus became a memorial to God's faithfulness and a reminder that He is capable of transforming even moments of doubt and impossibility into testimonies of joy and victory. Before Isaac's birth, Abraham had already become the father of Ishmael at 86 years old, through Hagar, an Egyptian servant of Sarah. This event was the result of a moment of weakness and impatience when Sarah, realizing she had not yet conceived, suggested that Abraham have a child with Hagar in an attempt to fulfill the divine promise through human means. Although Ishmael was conceived outside God's original plan, he was loved by Abraham and played a significant role in the story. For many years, Ishmael was Abraham's only son, and his presence brought both joy and challenges. When Isaac was born, fulfilling God's promise, the family dynamic changed drastically. The birth of Isaac, the child of the promise, brought a mixture of joy and tension. The episode that occurred during Isaac's weaning was the culmination of this family conflict. At that time, the weaning of a child was a significant event, often celebrated with a grand feast, symbolizing a new stage in the child's life. During this celebration, Ishmael mocked Isaac. Although the biblical text does not specify exactly what was said or done, Ishmael's attitude was enough to provoke a severe reaction from Sarah, who perceived the gesture as a threat to Isaac's position as heir. Sarah immediately asked Abraham to expel Hagar and Ishmael. This request was extremely painful for Abraham. Ishmael was his legitimate son, and he loved him deeply. Abraham was torn between his love for Ishmael and the need to protect God's promise through Isaac. However, God intervened, comforting Abraham in his distress. In Genesis chapter 21, verse 12, God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed about the boy or your servant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." God assured Abraham that although Ishmael was not the heir of the promise, he also had plans for him. God promised to care for Ishmael and make him into a great nation, reaffirming his faithfulness in blessing Abraham's descendants, albeit in a different way. With this assurance, Abraham obeyed God's guidance and sent Hagar and Ishmael away, providing them with water and bread for their journey. In one of the most remarkable and challenging moments in Abraham's story, God commanded something that seemed inconceivable: to offer Isaac, the child of the promise, as a burnt offering. This command is recorded in Genesis chapter 22 and represents one of the deepest tests of faith in the entire Bible. For Abraham, the situation was extremely complicated and laden with emotional, spiritual, and even rational implications. Isaac was not only the son whom Abraham deeply loved, he was the fulfillment of a divine promise that had taken 25 years to come to fruition. Through Isaac, God had guaranteed that Abraham would become the father of a great nation, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand on the seashore, and that through them all the nations of the earth would be blessed. How then could Abraham reconcile the command to sacrifice his son with these promises? The tension between God's command and the promise he had made this test even more painful and incomprehensible. Despite this, Abraham demonstrated extraordinary faith. He did not question God, even when faced with this seemingly contradictory request. Over the course of his journey with God, Abraham had learned that the Lord is faithful and trustworthy, even when his actions or commands defy human understanding. Abraham trusted not only in God's goodness, but also in his unlimited power. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, we are told that Abraham believed that, if necessary, God could raise Isaac from the dead to fulfill his promises. However, before Isaac was sacrificed, at the most tense and decisive moment of this test of faith, God intervened in an extraordinary way. An angel of the Lord called out to Abraham from heaven, commanding him not to lay a hand on Isaac, and reaffirmed that Abraham had passed the test because he had not withheld his only son. Then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a nearby thicket. This ram, provided by God, was offered as a sacrifice in place of Isaac. The divine provision at that moment is one of the most significant events in the biblical narrative, filled with symbolism and pointing to something much greater. The substitution of Isaac with the ram was not only an immediate relief for Abraham and Isaac, it was also a powerful foreshadowing of God's redemptive plan. This ram, offered as a substitutionary sacrifice, symbolizes Christ, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. John chapter 1, verse 29. Just as the ram took Isaac's place, Jesus took the place of all humanity, offering himself as the perfect sacrifice to pay for the sins of the world. The event on Mount Moriah, therefore, was not only a test of faith, but also a glimpse of the gospel and the redemptive work that God would accomplish through his Son. Later, the Bible tells us that Abraham did not want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman. Therefore, he asked his trusted servant to go to his homeland and find a wife for Isaac among his relatives. Abraham was fully confident that God would help in this mission, and the servant also placed his trust in the Lord. In the end, God guided everything so that Rebekah was chosen as Isaac's wife, showing that he was in control. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. Isaac's marriage was arranged, as was common in that time, and according to Genesis chapter 24, we can see that the marriage between Isaac and Rebekah was formalized while still at the bride's family home. This means that when Rebekah left her home to accompany Abraham's servant, she was already legally Isaac's wife, even though the two had not yet met in person. Thus, when the Bible recounts the moment Isaac brought Rebekah into his tent and took her as his wife, they were already officially married. However, Isaac and Rebekah's marriage faced difficult moments. For many years, Rebekah suffered because she was unable to have children. The Bible tells us that Isaac prayed to God for his wife, and after 20 years of marriage, God answered his prayer. Rebekah finally became pregnant and gave birth to twins, Esau and Jacob. At that time, Isaac was already 60 years old. However, as a father, he showed a weakness by favoring Esau, his eldest son, while Rebekah had a closer relationship with Jacob. This favoritism brought conflict to the family. When Esau and Jacob were adults, Rebekah helped Jacob deceive Isaac so that he would receive the blessing intended for the firstborn instead of Esau. Jacob and Rebekah's plan caught Isaac by surprise, but everything happened according to God's purposes. Even before the twins were born, God had announced that the older would serve the younger. Isaac's preference for Esau revealed a certain lack of spiritual understanding regarding what God had already decided. In the New Testament, in Romans chapter 9, the Apostle Paul explains that Jacob's selection was part of God's sovereignty. Although Jacob used deceit to take what belonged to Esau, the Bible shows us that God can transform wrongful situations into something good, fulfilling his plans in ways we often do not understand. Overall, the Bible portrays Isaac as a man who was greatly blessed by God. Throughout his life, he accumulated wealth, power, and respect, becoming an influential man of his time. He prospered in foreign lands, faced challenges, and yet saw God's hand guiding and protecting his journey. Even amid adversities, such as the disputes over wells with the Philistines, Genesis chapter 26, Isaac maintained his faith and perseverance, and God continued to bless him, granting him peace and abundance. Isaac was not perfect. In a moment of weakness, he lied about Rebekah, claiming she was his sister to protect himself, repeating a similar mistake made by his father, Abraham, Genesis chapter 26, verses 7 through 10. Additionally, his personal preferences, such as favoring Esau, created divisions within his own household. This choice, though human, reflected a certain difficulty in aligning his desires with God's sovereign purpose, as God had already declared that Jacob would be the heir of the divine blessing. Isaac also demonstrated reluctance to fully accept God's plans for his descendants, initially preferring to follow the cultural traditions of his time. Despite his failures and limitations, Isaac's life was marked by examples of faith, obedience, and perseverance. He proved to be a man of prayer, interceding for Rebekah during her years of barrenness and trusting that God would fulfill his promises. He also lived a life of peaceful character, avoiding unnecessary confrontations, such as when he chose to withdraw rather than engage in conflict with the Philistines over wells. While Isaac's story might seem less remarkable compared to the narratives of his father, Abraham, or his son, Jacob, his life was significant. He played a crucial role in the fulfillment of God's promises, and his relationship with the Lord earned him a place in the Hall of Faith, as recorded in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 20, where his faith is recognized in blessing Jacob and Esau concerning future events. Isaac, the child of the promise, is living proof of God's faithfulness and his power to fulfill his promises, even in the face of situations that seem humanly impossible. From the beginning, his story is marked by miracles and divine intervention. Born to elderly and barren parents, Isaac was a gift from God to Abraham and Sarah, demonstrating that nothing is beyond the Lord's reach. He not only personifies the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, but also points to God's eternal plan to redeem all humanity through Christ, the true descendant of the promise. Isaac represents the freedom that comes from divine grace, the same grace offered to all of us in Christ Jesus. Just as Isaac was born supernaturally, we too, as children of the promise, are spiritually born through the power of God and the redemptive work of Jesus. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 28, the Apostle Paul reminds us that, like Isaac, we are children of the promise, called to live in the freedom and inheritance God has prepared for his children. Isaac's life also teaches us that God uses imperfect people to accomplish his perfect purposes. Though Isaac faced moments of weakness and failure, such as lying about Rebekah or showing favoritism toward Esau, God remained faithful to him and continued to guide him. These human failings did not prevent the Lord from fulfilling his plan. On the contrary, they show that God's grace is sufficient to transform us, shape our character, and use us for his eternal purposes. Additionally, Isaac is an example of perseverance and trust. He patiently waited for years to have children, praying and trusting in the Lord. Even when faced with challenges, such as conflicts with the Philistines over wells, he chose peace and reconciliation, demonstrating a spirit of humility and trust in God to provide for his needs. Isaac's story invites us to reflect on God's faithfulness in our own lives. Just as God was faithful to Isaac, he is faithful to each of us. Isaac reminds us that God's promises are unbreakable and that he never fails to keep his word. His life declares that even amid our limitations and struggles, God transforms us and uses us as part of his eternal plan. Finally, Isaac points to Christ, the true child of the promise, through whom all the nations of the earth are blessed. He teaches us that God's grace does not depend on our merits, but on his love and faithfulness. Like Isaac, we are called to live by faith, trusting that God is powerful to do infinitely more than we can imagine, transforming our lives into living testimonies of his grace and goodness. Now, write in the comments if you enjoyed learning about Isaac's story. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications to watch more videos like this. May God bless you.